We're talking right now about the end of the pink tide in Latin America. This is not me saying it. It's some of the most staunch defenders of it here in the USA. I would say we don't know what's going to happen next in Latin America. After all, in Mexico, they just elected Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, who is a very staunch left-wing leader, although you could say he's not as far left as Hugo Chavez or some of the other past leaders of these Marxist countries in Latin America. But if you read through this article, and I glossed over it. This is the rise and fall of the pink tide in the International Socialist Review. They really bemoan what's been going on, and they talk about Mariátegui and Gramsci and Trotsky, a lot of these big time figures on the Latin American left, and I'm sorry to tell them, okay, the average person around the world, you might think that Marxist theory is very intriguing and that it offers all of these big lessons for how to reshape society. And, they even put it in these words: another world is possible, as Hugo Chavez said. You could put it that way. I don't think the majority of people around Latin America or here or anywhere else really find that resonates with them anymore, because of their need to really function day to day, have basic foodstuffs, have things like the services of being able to go to a hospital, being able to get clean water. In those countries where the pink tide has basically gone through, a lot of that really hasn't been accomplished. In fact, in some cases, it's just been the complete opposite. It's been a failure. So, this is my second take of this video. I'm not going to read through this again. I do invite you to read this. It's kind of amusing, but it does explain a lot about the left-wing mindset if you want to at least give it a shot. So I will put a link to this in the description, as I usually do with most articles that I cite. However, so being that as it may, what does that really mean for some of these countries? So you may have seen, I don't know if you follow the same media that I do, that in Brazil, there were 8,300 doctors working in poor and remote regions of Brazil, and they are being pulled out by Cuba. And this could end up becoming a problem for Cuba, because what are they going to do with those people? It's not as if there's like a ton of things for them to do back home. In fact, Cuba had kind of a specific benefit from this. So it says Cuba has begun withdrawing 8,300 doctors. So I can't believe this. I just noticed this. The Guardian, this bastion of left-wing thought, it's being supported by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. I mean, can you get fucked any harder? There is no real principled left anymore in media. That's all I'm going to say. Unless you go for International Socialist Review or something like that. I guess you could say The Intercept, for example, is really hardcore left. They're not really corporatist at all. Of course, they have a few weird patches right in there, here and there. I personally am not on the left anyway, so it doesn't really matter for me. I just find it breathtaking that the Guardian is receiving money from the Gates Foundation. On Tuesday, Brazil published an emergency tender for doctors trained in the country to replace the Cubans who were working under a program called Mais Médicos, or more doctors. Chartered flights have begun carrying the Cuban doctors home, some carrying televisions and other goods, causing queues and canceled appointments where they worked. Medical experts are worried the government will be unable to fill all the vacancies before they have all left by WHO's expected final date of December 12th. I am extremely concerned about the potential health impact of this and how Brazil will be able to fill those positions, said Albert Coe, a professor of epidemiology at the Yale Public School of Public Health who has worked in Brazil. The result will be an abrupt fall in medical attention, said Enrique Passos, a medical supervisor for Cuban doctors working in far-flung indigenous communities in the Amazon, many of which got their first doctor under More Doctors. Cuba announced it was pulling out of the program on November 14th, blaming Bolsonaro for declaring plans to modify the terms of the program by insisting that Cuban doctors validate their diplomas and sign individual contracts. So that's, I mean, that's an interesting demand. I would hope that people would be able to validate their diplomas if they went to medical school. Let me see here. It also accused him of making direct, contemptuous, and threatening comments. Earlier in the month, Bolsonaro, who had questioned whether Brazil could maintain diplomatic relations with Cuba, and said that more doctors could only continue if Cuban doctors validated their diplomas and received their full pay. So he's actually, technically, he was looking out for the good of the doctors, if you want to put it that way. Obviously, I think Cuba didn't see it that way. Currently, Cuba keeps around 75% of the doctor's 2,400 pound allowance, although housing and food is paid by local authorities. So for every 2,400 pounds, which I believe would probably be like $3,000 a month, maybe even more than that. So basically, the Cuban government gets 1,800 pounds of that. That's what you need to know. Even so, for Cuban doctors, the experience can be life-changing. Janet Rosales Rojas, 30 years old, spent 3 years working in the Brazilian town of Poços de Caldas, where on average she earned more than 10 times her monthly salary in Cuba. She returned to the island last year and was able to buy an apartment in Havana. You earn much more than what you get in Cuba. I always wanted to travel and treat people in other countries. This was my chance. Leasing medical professionals is Cuba's main export, bringing in more hard currency than tourism. Last year, professional services by doctors and nurses brought in $11 billion compared to $3 billion in tourism. That is really something, by the way. The chance to earn abroad is a major incentive to study medicine, especially after a decade of private sector expansion where young Cubans have become less willing to work for the state. Sending doctors abroad also helps Cuba project soft power. Cuban doctors are currently working in 67 countries, and Cuban medical teams are often at the forefront of disaster relief projects in the region where they work for free of charge. In Brazil, more than 18,000 doctors have taken part, and 63 million people benefited, according to the country's health ministry. Bolsonaro has been a fierce critic of the program since it was introduced by leftist President Dilma Rousseff in 2013, and he is not alone in his criticisms. When the first contingent arrived in Brazil, they were booed by local doctors, and the Brazilian Medical Association said the scheme left Brazil submissive to another country. We can't allow Cuban slaves in Brazil, and we can't keep feeding the Cuban dictatorship, Bolsonaro told reporters on Sunday. But some of the Cuban doctors disagree with such criticisms. I don't think it's right the government kept most of the money, but the Brazilian people are also slaves to high taxes. High taxes, said the Cuban doctor who talked via WhatsApp from an indigenous reserve on the condition his name was not revealed. We are in a crossfire between two political ideals, said Henry Yant, a Cuban doctor who visits isolated indigenous and riverside communities in the Amazon state of Pará for a floating health project called Saúde e Alegria, Health and Happiness. We're doctors, not politicians. Coe said the Brazilian doctors were originally given priority when the program launched. The Cubans came in after they failed to sign up. Brazil produces a lot of medical doctors, said Coe, but where they work is distributed unequally. They attend the wealthier sectors of society rather than the poor. According to the Brazilian Association of Collective Health, in around 10% of municipalities, the only doctors are Cubans. The program has resulted in widened access and improved the quality of health attendance. So that's what's going to be controversial is what statistics will be reliable now that Basically, Bolsonaro has taken over, and he's basically going to have this tug of war with certain institutions that will be considered by his side to have been biased towards the Brazilian Workers' Party, which was Lula and Rousseff's party. So that's going to be a big issue going forward. Carlos Lula, the health secretary of the dusty northeastern state of Maranhão, said that previous attempts to hire Brazilian doctors had floundered, adding that he feared the 471 Cuban doctors currently working there would be hard to replace. The impact would be terrible, he said. I have a big demand and a small supply of doctors. So we're seeing really there will be a difficult adjustment period in Brazil. And yeah, I mean, I'm not somebody who opposes Bolsonaro, but I would say you have to leave open the possibility that this could be catastrophic for certain communities in Brazil. So he can't just say, well, we're just going to kick the Cuban doctors out and it's going to resolve itself. No. If there are communities where there is no other health professional, this could be a real problem. And it seems to be that there are some. So we'll have to see what happens. But what's going to happen with Cuba? So I will have you know, when I was in middle and high school, I used to read a lot about the Cold War. Did a lot of projects on it for school. And one of the conflicts that I read a lot about was the Angola and Mozambique conflicts in Africa, which were Cold War proxy conflicts that the Soviet Union and the USA and China all used in order to fight against each other. So in Angola, for example, you had a colonial struggle against the Portuguese government. Portugal ruled Angola and Cabinda, which is a small part of Portugal that's separated. It's called an exclave, which is a little further north of the Congo. So Cabinda and Angola were basically ruled by Portugal until 1975. And there were three rebel groups that were fighting against the government, the Portuguese government. There was the Marxist MPLA, the FNLA, which was supported by, I believe it was the USA, and Zaire, which was an anti-communist country at the time, ruled by the Mobutu dictatorship. And then the third group was UNITA, which was supported by China. And eventually, the MPLA won. Angola became kind of a Soviet client state, and the FNLA fell apart and were defeated. I think they signed a peace treaty with Cuba in 1984. But the other group, UNITA, allied with South Africa and the USA, and there was a proxy conflict for about 12 years where Cuba and the Soviet Union would prop up the government of the MPLA, and they would fight against South African and UNITA troops coming from the south. And it was a very bloody and unknown conflict. To this day, most people around the world couldn't even, they don't really. It never really factored into the world news because ultimately people don't know that Angola has a major supply of oil and also a major supply of diamonds and a number of other minerals. But it's one of the poorest countries in the world. So after 1989. Cuba had to withdraw its troops and presence in Angola, and in exchange, they couldn't get any more of the commodities that they were getting from Angola, basically in exchange for military hardware, in exchange for certain, I believe they also had a doctor exchange program, similar to the one we were talking about just now about Brazil. So they entered a period called the special period, okay? And this is a short segment about that from CGTN, which is Chinese English news. But I figured we might as well watch it to learn exactly. This is the effect that could happen on Cuba because, again, that apparently that type of health services contracting is a major part of the Cuban economy.
Are in Cardenas, an industrial town on the north coast of Cuba. There are few cars or buses on the streets. Instead, most people here travel by bicycle or on horse-drawn carriages.
Cardenas prides itself on using alternative forms of transport, but for many Cubans, bicycles are a grim reminder of the tough times everyone faced following the collapse of the Soviet Union.
I rode a bicycle for a year and a half. I will never ride a bicycle anymore.
For sociologist Marta Nunez, these were the hardest days of her life.
And all of a sudden, all of us had nothing. Nothing. No energy, no electricity, no water, no soap, no nothing.
Shortly after the revolution, Fidel Castro turned to the Soviet Union following the trade embargo imposed by the United States. The Soviets ended up buying all the sugar Cuba could produce at inflated prices and selling it, oil and everything else it needed, at subsidized rates. Then suddenly, it all dried up. Castro announced they'd entered a special period in a time of peace, comparing the ensuing deprivations to a wartime siege. Delia Lopez is co-author of a recently published book on the special period.
The impact was brutal. Since we did not have oil, we could not operate our factories, do agriculture, and the homes had no power.
Okay, she's saying we did not have our oil. So I believe Cuba imported their oil from both Russia, the Soviet Union at the time, and Angola. And in 1989, Angola abandoned Marxism-Leninism. I don't believe that they severed ties with Russia, but basically once they decided that the system was up, I mean, they had no more use for this for the Cubans as allies as such, and South Africa wasn't really fighting in Angola anymore. It was really just more of an internal conflict. So Cuba didn't have anything to offer in return to Angola for for getting their oil. So except maybe cold hard cash. So it was a real problem for them to buy oil at the time. And really, if you think about it, Cuba doesn't necessarily have a lot of things to offer in terms of commodities and raw materials in the world economy. So that was a real problem for Castro during the end of the Cold War.
Y las casas no tenían electricidad.
Cuba ended up importing more than 1 million bicycles from China because it had run out of fuel for cars. In the countryside, tractors were replaced by oxen, and without fertilizers or fuel for irrigation, there were severe food shortages. Everyone went hungry and lost weight. But for Delia Lopez, it was the blackouts which hurt the most.
Los apagones fueron una especie de espada.
The blackouts were like a sword, striking at the heart of Cubans during the special period, because in the heart of the summer months here, it's almost impossible to live without an electric fan.
Es imposible vivir sin un ventilador.
Thousands fled the island on makeshift boats in a bid to find a better life in the United States. The US reacted by tightening the trade embargo, hoping to push Cuba to the brink of collapse and bring about regime change. But the system survived, and eventually a new benefactor stepped in, Venezuela's Hugo Chavez, who used his oil and petrodollars to come to Cuba's aid. These days, Venezuela is in crisis and can no longer afford such generous assistance, while the US, under President Donald Trump, is once again trying to pressure Cuba to change.
Cuba was never as dependent on Venezuela as it was on the Soviet Union, and today it has commercial ties with a whole range of countries, including China and the European Union.
The economy is struggling, and for many, times remain tough. But the experience of the special period points to the resilience of the Cuban people. Michael Voss, CGTN, Cardenas, Cuba.
All right, so I think the segment speaks for itself. It is kind of slanted in a positive pro-Cuban government way, given that China and Cuba do have good relations. That's fine. Good for them, I guess. I would say this, okay? Cuba will have to change a lot of its internal policies just to be able to adapt to the collapsing the collapsing pink tide in Latin America. Okay, obviously they can't get the oil that they used to from Venezuela, and now also probably from Brazil, which is an oil exporter for those of you that don't know. So this is going to be a problem for them. But like the narrator said, you could have a little more flexibility in Cuba owing to the issue of them having relations with more countries around the world. So I think it's going to be a very interesting process. Look, 4 or 5 years ago, remember that the Castro brothers were ruling Cuba. Now, Raul's retired, Fidel is dead. So the current leadership might be more open to adaptation and, kind of changing their ways from within without actually opening up the political system. Maybe doing something in the vein of China, because you can see what China did in order to really liberalize its economy, even while the political system itself is very oppressive and draconian. So I don't know. I mean, it's interesting. I'm not here to just condemn people. I really don't agree with socialism at all anyway, but I'm not going to try to prognosticate and tell Cuban people what to do. I personally think that they are going to have to change something simply out of necessity because of what's happening in Brazil and probably what's going to be happening in other countries in that area, such as Ecuador and Nicaragua. Venezuela is still sunken in debt and everything. So let me know what you think. Please like this video, subscribe to my channel, share the video. Also comment when it uploads. Subscribe to my other channel, Razor Ray Live Wounds, for the time being. And also please donate to the Patreon. And I will see you guys next time. Have a happy Monday.